Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Transatlantic ParaRadio show with your co-hosts, myself, Andy Mercer, and over in the States, Ronald Murphy.
Hello, Mr. Mercer. How are you doing today, sir?
Not too bad at all. Just getting all the notes together for this evening show. We're going to continue talking about the topic we were talking about last week, but let's get ourselves up and rolling and see how things are. So, what have you been up to this week? Anything particularly interesting?
Nothing particularly interesting, but I wanted to say that when we left our program last time, it was a bit of a serial cliffhanger, wasn't it? It was like an old-time radio show. We talked about the victims, and then we started to mention a little bit about the possible suspects. So I think we left everybody kind of hanging. So I'm really looking forward to delving deep into who some of these culprits might be and who they might not be.
Absolutely, but let's keep them hanging on a bit longer, shall we?
I think that's a good idea. But yes, since last time we talked, not much happened to me personally, but, for America, we have an inauguration, we have a new president, and, so things are a little bit up in the air right now for everybody on this side of the Atlantic, and I'm sure a bit on your side of the Atlantic, too, because, any kind of pebble thrown in that pond will produce a ripple effect.
Oh, absolutely. We are obviously sitting back with eyes peeled, waiting to see what happens, waiting for the show to start, as it were. And we know that our Prime Minister is on her way over to come and see your new chap in about a week or so. And I think she's the first major head of state that he's going to be meeting up with. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And we've had in the past, we had back in the 1980s with a Republican president and a Conservative female Prime Minister, back with Reagan and Thatcher. And that seemed to work out overall okay. But, there are one or two areas that we could go into, but obviously we're a paranormal show rather than a political show, but it's almost like history repeating itself a little bit there, that we have that new president and a female prime minister, both of a similar political persuasion. So, yeah, well, it might be good for us, it might not be. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see.
Well, the one thing that we always point out on our program is the importance of history, and because we had that Thatcher-Reagan connection, a couple decades ago, we can now look at that and say what went right and then how it could go horribly wrong. So let's learn from our past rather than making the mistakes of our past yet again.
Absolutely, and unfortunately we don't have the luxury of time travel to redo those things that go wrong the first time. So, but we shall see. I'd like to be hopeful that things aren't going to turn out too badly, but you never know, Yeah,
that's right. Well, I do want to point out there was one very nice thing that your kingdom had done for us, or they actually sent Michael Flatley and his Lord of the Dancers over to actually perform for the newly elected President Trump. During the inauguration. So we had that little bit of a taste of the British Isles going on as well.
No, I didn't know that.
Well, I think that he wanted to prove that he was, there for all people. So how he would do that is get the whitest possible dance troupe out there.
That's true. I was actually, a friend of mine put up this list of the people at the inauguration, and it also mentioned the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which I thought, I know it exists, it's real, but it sounded like some kind of punk band to me.
Well, what's interesting, there was some scandal going with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. If there could be scandal with the Mormons, but the leader, I guess it would be the choir director or whatever, she actually dropped out. She said that her political leanings did not match his political leanings, and she actually backed out. But the show still went on. But yeah, of course, there was huge headline bands that performed for Donald Trump. The mega band Three Doors Down performed for him. I'm sure that you're just kicking yourself that you didn't make it over there for this. We had a couple of country singers perform, and well, that's about it. But I mean, you had three bands perform for him.
Yes, I've never heard of Three Doors Down.
Neither did most other people.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Yeah. But I think we also had Toby Keith. You know who Toby Keith is, right?
No idea. Sorry.
So I would think that beer for my horses would be a very popular rallying cry over there for your football teams, but I guess that's not it.
Not too many horses around. Beer, yes. Horses, not so many.
That's right. No, but he's a country guy, and he definitely appeals to the least common denominator. It's about drinking and women and well, that's about it. But I mean, it was still. So it was interesting to watch because so many people refuse to be there, which definitely does not unite a country in any ways. I mean, we have a president that is elected. You would think that we would have to come together. You know, we are, you know, a country that has, by our democratic process, elected somebody, and instead of all coming together, we actually are trying to start to form these little camps and everything, which is very divisive. So I would much rather see people going to the event than boycotting the event, because it's in a way of saying, you know, we accept what's going on and we're still one nation, so let's make it work. But no, my friend, that's not what is going on. There's riots going on and the vandalism. Well, it's interesting, too, that the second part of our Jack the Ripper show follows up the inauguration, because when we talked at the first show, you were giving us some insights about the political system that was involved in Victorian London at this particular time. And you were talking about riots, and you were talking about people, you know, needing work and needing, you know, shelter and needing all this other stuff. And we can see it mirrored now today. But you can imagine at the time of the Jack the Ripper killings, I mean, what might have been going on as well. I mean, there would have been marches and there would have been vandalism, and people were truly scratching for survival, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, the East End of the time was comparable to the Wild West in terms of limited law abidingness. The police forces themselves were understaffed, under-equipped, and were finding it very difficult. I mean, it kind of brings us back to the whole question of, you know, what made this story, Jack the Ripper, so famous in the first place. And it really does come down to the fact that the press of the time was looking for a story to basically beat up the head of the police at the time, to Charles Warren. Remember we were saying last time, only the previous summer in 1887, there had been mass demonstrations in Trafalgar Square, which, funny enough, is where the poll tax riots happened in the 1980s, when I was actually at. But there were huge demonstrations there about unemployment, and they called in the military, and people died. Horses trampled people to death. So the press were very much on the back of Sir Charles Warren after that. And so when you had a series of unsolved, violent, gruesome murders taking place in the East End of London, it was a perfect opportunity to basically give Warren the hell on earth, basically, to make his life even more and more difficult. So,
yeah. Now let me ask you, Andy, while we're talking about this, would the press have done this as well to take people's minds off of what was going on, as you know, take their minds off of what was happening on the streets and kind of focusing it into this sort of tabloid events that are going on?
Not so much take the focus away from us to simply sell newspapers, to basically have sensationalist stories that people would lap up and find interesting, because it was very quickly spreading, the story itself, the murders were spreading way beyond the confines of London and the UK. It's spreading off into Europe, and there was articles even in American newspapers about this notorious, mysterious serial killer. As we were saying last time, the name Jack the Ripper just was inspirational, and I have no doubt in my mind at all that it was invented by a press person, that it was a press reporter, journalist, who was behind the writing of the letters that we talked about last time. Certainly the original ones that are the ones that use the rather strange language of being buckled and quit ripping. It's all that kind of very odd, flowery language that you would not have heard someone in the East End really using. It sounds much more as someone who's better educated trying to pretend to be of a lower class. So, you know, that was one of the things that was definitely fueling the interest, was the name itself. But also, as I say, behind this was this concerted effort of the press to try and show its power and influence, that it could actually influence events and cause high positioned people to lose their jobs. And so they kind of targeted Warren, if you like, as the target that they were going to attack to try and get him out of his position. So they say the chances of having a gun because he couldn't solve these vicious, violent murders was heaven sent in that for them. It was a chance to really big up the feelings of the police. So it also kind of feeds into what we'll talk about a bit later on with some of the more conspiratorial theories about who the Ripper might have been, that, somehow the police were being deliberately incompetent because of the press were highlighting everything that went wrong with the investigation or their failures, and didn't highlight the more positive things that were happening that may have suggested that they may well have had an idea of who the Ripper was, which is obviously what we're going to get into a bit later on.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, Andy. To start off the program, should we go over the canonical victims and then just kind of take it from there? Let's give a little bit of rehash of what happened previously.
Absolutely, I think that's definitely the best place to start. Now, really, the first is a kind of a bit of a thing. I'm glad you mentioned the canonical idea because there really is only 5 definite victims that we were saying before. Certainly, the press at the time were trying to build up other murders that were ascribing them to Ripper because, again, it kind of fitted with that agenda of them trying to demonstrate that there was more going on, that the East End was absolutely lawless and they could use it to a way to berate the police and give them a hard time. But essentially there are the 5 actual definite victims, although, as we said last time, I am more convinced than ever that there was actually 4, and one of them was roped in because of the time and the place of her murder. The first one I said before was Mary Ann or Polly Nichols, found basically on... Hello?
Yep.
Strange noises. It was found in Bucks Row, where she was initially thought to have simply have been had a throat slit. In fact, when the guys first found her, they actually thought she was still alive, but it was quite clear that she had been murdered. And it wasn't until she was taken back to the mortuary to be examined that they discovered the rather large gash that ran from the abdomen to the breastbone, basically slicing her open. That was the first definite Ripper murder. There had been some murders and attempted murders previously that have later on been ascribed to the Ripper, but they don't fit the exact mode of the murder, that the way in which the Ripper was killing people. So that's definitely the very first one, was Polly Nichols on the 31st of August 1888, which was the late summer bank holiday. So it'd been a busy, lovely summer's day, and people had been out enjoying themselves. So she probably could have met any one of a number of people who may have not been working that day because it was a bank holiday.
You know what, Andy? That's an interesting thing, and I've never thought about this. Has anybody ever looked back to see what the weather conditions were on these particular days?
Not that I know specifically of the weather itself, because later on it gets into November, which was actually quite a cold November that year. But certainly the August the 31st bank holiday is often the end of summer bank holiday here, and usually that week and the next couple of weeks afterwards are still pretty good. But it had been a pleasant day, apparently. It had been a lot of people out enjoying the late summer sun, and it was a bank holiday. So even though people worked incredibly long hours, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week from sort of dawn till dusk, the bank holidays tended to be observed. And the interesting fact, of course, the last murder wasn't on a bank holiday, but it was the day before the Lord Mayor's show, which again people tend to take a bit of time off to enjoy the Lord Mayor's show. So that happened the night before that, which, funny enough, meant there was a lot more press around at the time of the last murder because it was a day of the Lord Mayor's show. So the news about Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the last one, got out quite quickly and spread quite far, because by that point you'd now had this is the 5th murder of its kind, a very severe, violent murder. So the whole areas were much more patrolled by the police. There were a lot of vigilance committees that had been formed, vigilantes essentially going out and patrolling streets at night with clubs and torches, looking out for anybody who didn't really fit into the area. So, there was a lot of publicity by that point. This was reported across Europe, the final murder, but that was still a couple of months away, because the next murder took place on the 8th of September, and that was Annie Chapman, who was murdered in Hanbury Street, and it was in a small backyard behind a tenement building, which is a row of houses, and they all had archways between the two houses that led to a small back garden. So anybody could get through the archway into the back garden. You didn't have to live in the house to enter the garden, and often people would be found sort of sleeping rough in those archways because it protected them from the weather, and often prostitutes would take their clients into those backyards or archways, so that was nothing unusual. She was found on the following morning of September the 8th. Now, there were witnesses. Certainly somebody had observed her with a gentleman talking outside the Hanbury Street house not long before she was supposedly murdered. Now, I must admit, I've lost the notes of the person's name that was the name they gave, but they certainly did seem to identify Mary Annie Chapman with somebody of unknown identity, who they described as a shabby genteel appearance. Now, that's important because the term genteel is often used as a euphemism for Jewish or East European appearance, so they're kind of suggesting in that direction. The following morning, or let's say it's later on than that morning, a gentleman in the house next door went out to use the toilet outside. These are all houses had toilets outside in those days, and he actually heard a woman's voice say the word no, and then a thump against the fence. Now, almost certainly that was definitely Annie Chapman being murdered, and the Jack the Ripper was standing the other side of the fence. If he'd looked through the gap in the fence, he may have seen who the killer was, but he didn't. He just thought it was some kind of argument and just left them to it. And it wasn't until the following morning itself that a local chap living in the house who came down to feed his rabbit discovered the body. And so that was the second victim of Jack the Ripper. She was found lying with her head pointing towards the house and her feet sort of pointing towards the back of the small garden. It wasn't a garden in terms of grass, etc. It was just stone paving, basically. Again, apologies for the graphic nature of the description, but essentially she'd been cut open from basically the base up to her sternum, and this time organs had been removed from the body, but not taken away. They hadn't actually been removed from her completely. They'd simply been actually dumped on one of her shoulders, and she was left found like that. There was bloodstains on the fence beside her, and I say again, cut very deep across the throat, almost decapitating her, but not quite. I don't think it necessarily was his intention to cut her head off. It was simply the very forceful way in which she'd had her throat slit. Again, looking at the bodies, it's been suggested strongly that the woman was grabbed from behind, and the knife was then cut once very deeply across the throat in order to basically cut the windpipe off so they couldn't make any sound, cut through both arteries, left and right, ventricles and arteries, so blood loss was rapid. But it would have been, if the killer was standing behind her, the blood would have gone forward and sideways, not onto the murderer himself. So quickly the body would then be sort of fallen to the ground, and only then after that the mutilations were carried out, which starts pointing us very much towards what we today would know as being sort of psychopathic murder, violence of its own nature, that there wasn't necessarily a particularly sensible or sane reason for these killings other than the individual's own psychology being involved. This is basically a psychopathic serial killer. Now, as you were saying last time, the whole idea of a psychopath was meaningless in those days. It was not understood at all. I mean, they existed, certainly. Multiple killers have been known for centuries, but the whole psychology of what that was about was largely unknown. The idea that it had some kind of sexual connotation, which it clearly did because of the way the mutilations are, it's basically dehumanising a woman by those mutilations, and that was essentially the psychology behind what the Ripper was doing. That idea of some kind of sexual deviancy and perversion in late Victorian Britain was horrifying. They wouldn't talk of such things. They would even countenance the possibility that was going on, which is why you have almost from day one this problem of motive. Why would someone be doing these things? Now, that's an important element, because the lack of knowledge of how human psychology worked meant that people were often, theorists were looking for a motive to explain why these murders were happening. Now, there is an important element, which is something I'll definitely come back to a bit later on, but keep that in mind, that because of the way people understood murder to work, they always thought there was a reason for a murder that was logical, that was understandable. Well, not like it, but, murder for gain, financial gain, or revenge for being wronged, all those kind of things that we could kind of understand. But the idea that it's some kind of psychological deviance inside the person who's driving them to carry out psychotic episodes and violence against people because of abuse they might have experienced as childhood, etc., which is most likely the case for the Ripper, that it wouldn't have been something that was understood by the general populace or even by senior police at the time. And, psychotherapy and psychology was very much in its infancy at this time. I mean, even Sigmund Freud wasn't writing at this point, in the 1880s. It was very, very early on in that kind of field of medical endeavour. So the idea of there being some kind of motive will play an important feature in some of the theories that we're going to talk about a bit later on. But moving the clock forward, we get to the end of September 1888. We have what's known as the double event, which is basically two murders, obviously, happening at the same night, within about an hour of each other, possibly slightly less. The first one, which, as we talked about before, I suspect, and I know others do, that may well not have been the Ripper, or at least the same person. Whether it was a deliberate a copycat killing, or was just sensationalised by the press into being thought of being a Ripper killing, or because it was 40 minutes later that the second murder that night took place, and that second murder definitely was the Ripper, no doubt about it. The woman herself, Liz Stride, was actually Swedish by birth. She'd been over here since she was fairly young, but she was Swedish origin. Basically was outside a place called Duffield's Yard, which is on Berners Street. She was believed to have been essentially grabbed and pulled into this Duffield's Yard area and was being basically attacked when the owner of the yard, Louis Diemschultz, came back on his cart, having obviously been at work for the day. Get back. Now, his house and the adjoining property were used as a small kind of drinking home for East European workers who were kind of a socialist committee they'd formed. They were not trying to be anything too political, they were just more concerned about their own homeland and what was happening there, sort of Eastern Europe areas. But he pulled into the Duffield's Yard itself and saw a woman's body lying on the ground nearby. It was quite dark, there was obviously no street lights, so there were, but not in that immediate area. Thought it was just his wife. And, well, she was drunk, basically. Went inside and found his wife was there, happily sort of having a drink with the other people in their little bar. So went back outside, and that's when they discovered it was actually Liz Stride's body who was lying there. Now, again, to say the throat was cut lightly from left to right with a rounded-ended blade, whereas the previous cuts were definitely with a thin, sharp-ended blade. And as I say, both the first two victims, there were very, very deep wound across the throat. Single cut, looked like it almost decapitated the person. This wasn't the case. She'd only been quite lightly cut. Now, we were going back before talking about the one of the first letters that talked about clipping the lady's ears, just for jolly. Funny enough, a friend of mine pointed out, which is quite interesting, I did a bit of research and he was definitely correct. There was, in the 1700s, the practice of clipping women's ears who were accused and found guilty of being prostitutes. So he suggested, was this a reference to the idea that this woman was a prostitute and he was clipping their ears because they were prostitutes? Now, that makes sense in terms of the letter, that perhaps the person who wrote the letter was aware of that history. Although he does say he's doing it just for jolly, i.e. just for the fun of it. But what we know of both the victims that night, with Elizabeth Stride particularly, was that she had a hole in her ear where an earring had split open the ear. So there was an injury in the ear, but it was old. So, could be referencing that. The second one, the woman's ear was nicked by the knife. It was actually hanging off. It wasn't cut off completely. It was just damaged, again probably because of the force of the blade going across, cutting her throat. So you have Liz Stride, slightly cut across the throat. There were witnesses who had seen her with a man, and as I said, there was some confusion with the witnesses, as one witness actually thought the woman was being dragged towards Duffield's Yard, and the other witness thought she was being dragged away. Now, a man by the name of Israel Swartz had probably the best view. This was again a gentleman walking down the road at the time. He didn't speak a lot of English, having only recently come over here from Poland. And via translator, the police officer in charge of the case at the time, Frederick Aberlin, was able to get some kind of version of events. And that was literally what he could say, that she seemed to be being dragged. I think he's the one that said it was away from Duffield's Yard. But also he heard someone shout the word Lipski. Now, he wasn't sure if it was aimed at him, Israel Swartz, because he did look very Jewish, or it was aimed at the man who was attacking the woman that was happening across the road, because Israel Lipski was a poisoner who'd killed a couple of women the previous year who had been tenants in his building. He'd poisoned them to death, obviously, and being Jewish, that was something that they were emphasising with this show, Lipski. So Lipski had become a kind of insult towards Jewish people. But both Swartz decided he wasn't going to hang around, both with the violence he was seeing across the road and this person shouting. He just ran off and left them basically to it. So that was as much as could be said of the first victim. Now, it could well have been just one of those things, a kind of a violent attack or an argument that gone wrong, or something along those lines. If it wasn't for the fact that only 40 minutes later, in Mitre Square, which is no more than a few hundred yards away, there was another body found that was definitely the work of the Ripper this time. This was Kathy Eddowes in Mitre Square. Again, she'd been cut across the throat. That had been the means of death, if you like. Probably from behind, with a very deep wound across the throat. Bled out, blood was all over the cobblestones, and was dropped to the floor. Clothing was then cut open, and a whole series of wounds were happened to her abdomen area, cuts and slices, etc. The face was also, unfortunately, cut up as well and mutilated, which is where probably the wound to the ear may well have occurred if it wasn't for the original knife wound. So I should apologise to our listeners, by the way, this is getting a bit gory, but I think it's important to get the full picture of what was really going on. Again, wounds were quite substantial. Organs were lifted out of the body and placed on beside the woman, but sometimes some organs were missing this time. Now that's important because one of the main letters that came into the news, that didn't come into the news agency, I apologise, it went elsewhere, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the wounds was very, very well done, very precise. It had cut out a particular organ in the body very neatly. And this was observed in the autopsy and appeared in the press. And it built up more with that idea that somehow the person was a doctor, that they had medical knowledge how to carry out these kinds of wounds. So that theme was beginning to develop. And it's another one that starts to occur with some of the theories we can talk about a bit later on. But what happened was the kidney appeared to be missing from Kathy Eddowes. Now, obviously the police presence had already been built up because this is the third, possibly fourth murder of its kind, so there were more police around, and police were now searching this surrounding area for any kind of further evidence. And in a nearby alleyway called Galston Street, there was an archway, like we were talking about before, with the leading to tenement buildings, but this is an archway just between buildings that led to the next street. A piece of apron was found. The apron itself was undoubtedly from Kathy Eddowes' clothing. It fitted, obviously, a bit that was missing. It had a mixture of, I apologise for his feces, and Kathy Eddowes' blood on it. So it looked like the killer had used this piece of cloth to wipe his hands as he'd run away. So we had an idea for the first time of a possible direction of where he was going. He'd gone from Mitre Square to Galston Street, which is again no more than a few hundred yards away. So he was obviously heading in that direction. Where he was going, a matter of speculation. But what he'd done, dropped that cloth, was in this archway there was some graffiti written on the wall. Which, pause for a sec, I'm almost running out of air.
I hear that. You're doing a fantastic job, my friend.
That's okay. I'm going to find my notes of the actual wording, because if you remember saying last time, the wording did vary, and unfortunately it's in my other notebook, which I cannot for the life of me find. Give me a moment. I've called it up online. Because it gets the From Hell letter, which is one we missed out last time, which is quite an important letter.
No, take your time. This is riveting.
Good stuff. Now, you can probably tell I've told this story once or twice before.
Oh, yeah. Hey, it's like watching a virtuoso actor go into town, so this is good.
Oh, thank you. Right, the wording. Okay, there was where the cloth had been dropped in the Galston Street was the archway, and the wording had been written on the wall in chalk. Now, there are two slightly different versions, unfortunately, of the wording. It was written down by different police officers, and they came with slightly different wording. And now the two versions are as follows. One reads as, "The Jews are the men who are not to be blamed for nothing." The second version was, "The Jews are not the men that will not be blamed for nothing." So it's slightly different. There's an extra knot in there. But what was important was the spelling of Jews. It was very odd. Both seemed to agree that the word was spelt the same way, of Juwes or Juws. Now, again, we spell the word Jew Jew. There could be reasons behind that strange spelling. Now, I'm going to get back to that one a bit later on, because I want to talk about this graffiti. It's important because it was sensationalised in the press that this graffiti existed. Unfortunately, they didn't photograph it. Now, it was getting towards dawn by this point, about 4 or 5 in the morning, and they were a bit worried that if the word would spread, which it was going to, that there'd been another Ripper murder. Now, there'd been suggestions in the press that these kind of murders not the sort of thing Englishmen would do. There had to be a foreigner who'd done this. Which, there's xenophobic nastiness, we know, but that's just of the time. The call was no Englishman would commit murders like this, it has to be a foreigner. Now, if you got that sentiment running in the public, and then you get people seeing this graffiti, which was on the wall, was quite visible, the idea of stirring up anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rioting was a real possibility. These women were being murdered and no one was doing anything about it, so it seemed, according to the press, because they say the press were playing it all up. We could well have ended up with riots. There really were a number of cases where Jewish and foreign-looking people were being beaten up on the streets, being accused of being the Ripper, just for looking different and not looking like they belonged in the area. So the police were mindful that this could cause real problems. So they unfortunately decided to remove the graffiti before sunrise, which is a real shame. If you could get a photograph of it, we'd have had, one, the exact spelling of the word Jews and the exact wording, but they didn't. Some conspiracy theorists say that's because it was pointing to not Jews as in the Jewish people, but the spelling of Jewess was a link to Freemasonry. Now, we'll come back to that because it's a bit of an odd argument and one that kind of needs explaining almost to see why they thought that. But the suggestion was that the Jews are referring to was Freemasons, that the Freemasons will not be blamed for nothing. That's something that was a theory that developed long after the murders, but it was something that was still kind of prevalent until fairly, well, still is prevalent if you like, with some more sort of extreme conspiracy theories. But anyway, Sir Charles Warren, good old Sir Charles, the guy who was the problem in the first place, ordered it to be removed before it was photographed. So it was removed. But the important thing was, regardless of whether that graffiti was real or not, the fact that this piece of cloth was found and was undoubtedly that of Cathy Eddowes gave us some idea of where the Ripple was heading. Probably heading home. You know, you've done what you wanted to do that night. You're going to kind of head towards home. It's unlikely he was clever enough to go different routes to try and put people off. He's more likely to just head into the lawless parts of the East End, and that area was one of the worst areas. So, you have another victim on the ground, with this time definitely organs having been removed. Now, this appears in the press. Also, autopsies were held in public, so anybody could go along to them. So you can imagine there would be large audiences, large numbers of attendees to the public hearings of the autopsies. The findings of the coroner were read out, so people would know their organs had gone missing. Now, the reason why I mention this is because one of the more famous letters that came to the public's attention during this time was written, and it made references to this kidney. The first thing I want to point out, though, is that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of letters almost daily coming into the news agencies about people claiming to be, one, claiming to be Jack the Ripper, or two, putting forward all sorts of theories and ideas about who the Ripper might be. The police quite rightly ignored the vast majority of them. Only those that might have some kind of information that might have been provable or show a direct connection were being examined, like the Dear Boss letters with the Jack the Ripper name on it. But one letter came not to the police or to the news agency, but a chap called Mr. George Lusk. Now, George Lusk was the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. This is basically the head organiser of the vigilantes who were going out at night and patrolling the streets. He was a sensible, well-to-do gentleman who was basically cared about what was happening in his part of the world. He wasn't some kind of raving politico that he's been portrayed as on TV and in film sometimes. He was much more, wanted to try and help the police recognise they were understaffed, undermanned and underfunded, and was trying to do a bit more positive things. So he wasn't trying to cause riots, but he was organising nightly patrols of the streets to try and hopefully protect the people out there. The letter arrived, and what made it significant was it contained a piece of kidney. Now, it was already known by the public that one of her kidneys was missing. So the inference, of course, was that it was actually Cathy Eddowes' kidney. Now, I'll get into that in a sec. But basically, the wording of the letter was as follows. And I'll read it as it's written, including the very odd spelling to give this kind of strange wording. But Mr. Lusk, Sar, spelled S-O-R, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife, missing the E off the word knife, that took it out if you wait, W-A-T-E, a while longer. No E on while. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
Wow. This is like Hannibal Lecter.
Yep, somewhat, yeah, absolutely, yep, certainly so. The interesting thing was no reference to the name Jack the Ripper. Now, there is, again, something a little strange about some of these spellings. Now, he's spelt the word preserved in a very odd way indeed. P-R-A-S-A-R-V-E-D. Preserved. Now, okay, so he's trying to spell it almost phonetically, how you would pronounce a word rather than its correct spelling, which is fair enough. And t'other, spelled T-O-T-H-E-R. Instead of the other or other piece, t'other. Okay. But the way he spelt knife was intriguing. Now, if you spell the word knife and you can't spell, what would you put? N-I-F?
Well, sure.
He spelled it K-N-I-F. Why would you include the K if you can't spell properly? It doesn't make sense, does it? You wouldn't include the silent K. You're more likely to leave that one off and put the E at the end, or N-Y-F or N-I-F. But knife, it's odd that the way he's chosen to misspell words, it again suggests the possibility we're looking at more fakery. That it's somebody being a bit clever this time, rather than sending it to the police or to the news agency, where all they were going, send it to somebody individual, and it might sort of catch their attention, which of course it did. Very sensibly, Mr. Lusk presented the kidney to the police, and they took the kidney to a doctor to examine it. Now, it's a bit of a problem, this area, because it got confused in the press, because it was reported that the doctor they spoke to confirmed that it had Bright's disease, which is an effect that something that Kathy Eddowes suffered from, to do with excessive alcohol, and contained a lot of gin in the kidney, which she was known to be a heavy gin drinker. Now, it was reported in the press that it was a doctor who'd said this. In actual fact, it was a medical student who was working for the doctor at the time, who hadn't had a lot of experience, and it's quite possible that the press pressured him into saying this, because then when the actual doctor himself examined the kidney, he said, first of all, you can't tell from a kidney whether it belongs to a man or a woman. You can't tell its age. Bright's disease may be present, but it can also be caused just by heavy drinking. Now, to get hold of the kidney of a woman who drank heavily in the East End, or a man even, wouldn't be that difficult, with autopsies and coroner's reports and all that kind of stuff. Any medical student could have got hold of a kidney easily and passed it on to a reporter who wrote the letter, or it could be a medical student himself who was pranking this kidney and sending it to Mr. Lusk. Both are quite possible. But again, this failed. It's kind of... it's a big thing today, isn't it? At the moment, the whole idea about fake news, but fake news is by no means new. It was a common problem back in those days too. So you are left with this possibility that this kidney may or may not have belonged to Kathy Eddowes. There's a pretty good chance. I don't think it did. I think it was just a bit of a ruse by a medical student. It's also worth remembering that medical people were being put in the picture as genuinely being the Ripper anyway, so it kind of almost plays up to that notion. If you think you're a doctor, we can play along with this and do things that make it look like it is a doctor.
In a bit, though, whenever we go over the suspects, I think that this does come into play where it looks like somebody was trying to get the police off their trail by appearing to be somebody different than they actually were, taking on a persona of somebody of a lower class. And as you pointed out, the knife misspelling seemed to be deliberate, but they forgot about the KN. So it looked like there might have been somebody that was educated trying to take on the affectations of somebody from the East End.
Oh, absolutely. And as I say, I think this is people just sort of playing along with the game and trying to get themselves in the picture, in the limelight. Even if it's just say, well, haha, I wrote that letter, Not to everybody, just tell your friends, I look at this, how am I to get this into the press? I've fooled them. But the real Ripper wouldn't do this. There's just no way on earth that the real Jack the Ripper, the actual psychopathic killer, would do anything like this. Whoever he was living completely in his own world by this point. It was interested in nothing other than satiating his desire to kill, trying to deal with his own psychosis and how it would rear its head, because we're starting to see bigger gaps in the murders now. Between the first and the second was only a matter of 8 days. This is 3 weeks later, so there is a bigger gap growing, and it's because there is an increase in patrols and security and concern. So you now have 4, certainly 3, possibly 4, very violent murders being carried out that were of a very similar kind. Now, there were other violent assaults and attacks happening, which have been later linked into being the Ripper, but there were only these 4/3 that fit the modus operandi of this kind of killer. This killer doesn't swap, for example. He wouldn't slit the throat and basically gut one person and then multiply stab another one. That was too different. They've found a mode of murder that suits their own inner psychological processes. It's to say something within them. This neutering of a woman, turning her into just a mess, is dealing with some inner psychosis that this person was obviously struggling with. And then they wouldn't sit down and take time to write write letters to the press and send in bits of kidney. They wouldn't do that. Personally speaking, I don't know whether the killer genuinely took the kidney away or it was lost on his place because it was left on the ground along with the other organs. It's quite possible that happened, in the middle of the night being washed away with the blood. I don't know. But I certainly don't think... And I don't think any serious Ripper researcher takes the letters as being serious examples of what was happening, as being anything other than pranks and jokes and people trying to get their name in the press. And I'm going to go on to the suspects later on. There's a lot of that going on, people attaching their name to the Ripper, both as possible suspects as well as writing about other suspects or pointing fingers at people, because it was a big business. It was a big industry.
That's right. But some of the suspects are considered suspects because they have some sort of collection of body parts. That happens in at least a couple of cases. And I find that interesting as well, too. What would, lead a person to want to collect body parts, for number one, and then because they had the body parts and the letter stated that they took a piece of the liver home, then why couldn't this possibly be the Ripper? But like you had said, the Ripper was actually living in their own world. They believed, presumably, that they did not live by the rules of the world at large. That they were the emperor of their own domain. So this kind of toying with the mainstream media and with the police doesn't seem quite logical to me either.
Absolutely not. There's only one case that comes to mind of a serial killer who was actually deliberately, definitely taunting the police. And his mode of murder was totally different. I'm talking about the Zodiac Killer, of course, with his strange codes he used to send to the police. But, his was a completely different style and kind of murder. He was often a single gunshot, a single stabbing. He wasn't this kind of frenzied, violent, maniacal ripping apart of people that you see with Jack the Ripper. And other cases in history that have seen these kinds of killings, they don't contact the public, the police or anybody. They just live in their own world. Which gets us on to our last victim, definitely the last real Ripper victim, although there are many murders afterwards they try to attribute to the vicar, to the Ripper even.
Hey, I think you just came up with a new suspect.
Yes, the Reverend Ripper. In fact, that would be interesting, because he'd be able to move around quite freely without being stopped by anybody, wouldn't he, the vicar? You wouldn't think of a vicar.
He just pops right into a church.
Yeah, I'm sure someone somewhere's come up with the Ripper vicar.
Well, if they did, this is a good alternative history type of thing that we're talking about last time. So
absolutely,
this might have merit. This might have merit, my friend.
Yeah, you never know, Ripper vicar. But anyway, the last victim, Mary Jane Kelly. I think others have said before, one of the saddest victims. I mean, the woman herself was. The others were into their 40s. They were, getting on a bit. She was only 25. Now, there is a little bit of a question about her actual identity that no one's ever really tracked down definitively. Mary Jane Kelly in Ireland, but she certainly was Irish. She was thought to be in her early to mid 20s. Unlike the others, she worked from her home, a small little house she had, literally one room basically, in Dorset Street. And she was found on the morning, as I say, of the 9th of November. It was the Lord Mayor's show that day, so the streets were already lined with people waiting to see the show. Her landlord, or the landlord's representative, came along to basically collect the rent and hadn't seen Mary and hadn't been paid in about 6 weeks, so she was well behind. Basically, the room was locked up, but there was a smashed corner of one of the windows was broken, and there was a coat that had been pushed into the gap to keep the cold out. He basically pushed that out of the way and looked in and saw what remained of Mary Jane Kelly. Now, we talked about the details last time, I won't get into them again, but essentially it was an absolute mess. It was a total slaughter. There was little left of the original person.
This is the one where he could actually take some time and do what he wanted to without any fear of anybody coming upon the scene.
Absolutely, that is very much the point. He was free to do what he liked all night. There was no one going to stop him. And I think he was able to satiate a lot of his desire for the time being, just because there was no one to stop him, no one's going to prevent him. There were oddities about it. He's absolutely mutilated the poor woman's face completely beyond recognition, removed some organs, but they were all found in the room, although there were claims that some had gone missing. Later on, it was identified quite very clearly they were in the room. Set fire to some of the clothing in the fire, perhaps to create light, although there were candles nearby that were never lit, so that was a little strange. But we don't know we don't know how long the person was in there for, but they certainly had time to do everything they wanted to, and it was, as I said last time, you can find photographs on the internet, and you almost struggle to work out which bit's which. I mean, you kind of get the shape of the person, but trying to even identify eyes on the face is quite ridiculous. It's terrible.
And that's the point. I mean, he took a young woman and turned her into a pile of mangled flesh, and that was the purpose. I mean, he took a human being and he made them into the composition of just flesh and bones.
Absolutely, just left what was behind utterly inhuman. And that was really part of the psychosis he was experiencing.
Taking away the humanity. That's right. So that being said, Andy, let me ask you: why did the killing stop? What happened to Jack the Ripper?
Well, I'm going to come on to that in just a moment. I'm going to take a little break for now.
Keep on putting us in suspense.
Yes. I think we need to have a little advert break.
Good evening, Agent 47. It has come to our attention through the highest intelligence sources that Irene Allen Block has published her novel, The Psychic Spy. Our sources tell us that The Psychic Spy is a riveting thriller about Eileen Evans, a beautiful young psychic who is recruited by British intelligence during the Cold War to participate in their top-secret remote viewing spy program. Eileen soon finds herself plunged deeper into the darkest heart of the intelligence community as she is ultimately trained as a spy and a psychic assassin. Nick Redfern says The Psychic Spy is filled with adventure, intrigue, and shadowy characters, and as Irene Allen Block shows, the mind is a mysterious and dangerous tool. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to immediately purchase a copy of The Psychic Spy by Irene Allen Block, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Glenatai.com. This tape will self-destruct in 1 second.
Hi, this here is Maynard from down south in Tennessee, and my family came to this country on the Mayflower, so I embraced my British roots by listening to the Paranormal UK radio network. Boy, howdy, now I gotta go get me some pork rinds.
And we are back, having just done a little review of the victims of Jack the Ripper. Let's get on to the question of who was Jack the Ripper. Well, to answer your question that we paused with before a little break there, that is actually an absolute key issue. Why did the murder stop? Now, these kinds of murders, if they happen today in the modern world on the news, we'd know there's only two ways these sorts of murders stop. Either the person is captured or dies. There's no other reason. No killer of this kind in history has just suddenly stopped. Thought, oh, that's enough now. I won't do it anymore. It just doesn't happen that way. But because of the lack of real understanding of why or how this kind of murder worked, the question has often been asked, is there a reason why they decided to stop and go on and do other things instead? Or was there a reason that they wanted to complete a particular task of these certain numbers of murders, and that was enough and they were going to carry on doing what they're doing, just going with ordinary life, which, kind of doesn't make any sense. But the police are often criticised as being sort of in 60s and 70s, not having a real clue what's going on. But even they, very early on, had begun to have suspicions about certain possible people that they may have been responsible for it. Again, there are records which we'll get into a bit later on, but even as early as the murders themselves, names were being put forward as being possible Ripper suspects, but there was not a lot of investigation done because you deal with a time where there's no kind of forensic evidence. One of these things that was a real problem with this kind of murder was that, or indeed any kind of murder in those days, was you had to have witnesses, you had to have a motive that you could identify and therefore go after because of the motive that was suggested, and you had to really catch someone in the act or there soon afterwards to have any real chance of saying you are the killer without witnesses, without any kind of motive or theory as to why they were doing it. So that really opens up that kind of problem of, well, we need to find a reason for this person. If you can figure out why it's being done, we might be able to identify people who are doing it. Now, obviously there are famous killers who were at large at work at the time, and sometimes some researchers have tried to link in particular people that were known to be killers at the time into being maybe they were also Jack the Ripper. One particular one that comes to mind very early on was a guy called Neil Cream, who was a poisoner and was actually hanged. And it was claimed when he was hung for his murders, he actually said in the middle of being hung, "I am Jack the..." and basically was hung. So he was as if he himself was trying to claim that he was Jack the Ripper. But unfortunately, there's no witnesses at his hanging at the time. So that he said that. It was kind of a strange rumour that appeared almost from nowhere. And in fact, the guy who was responsible for actually carrying out the hanging wrote his own book and talked about the people he had hung and the murders who'd come through his hands, as it were. And when he talked about Dr. Neil Cream, he made no mention of him claiming to be Jack the Ripper, so that was just one of those little stories that got out there a bit. The first person to emerge in the press as being possibly identified as the Ripper was in 1894, a man by the name of Thomas Cutbush, who was incarcerated in a Lambeth workhouse, where sometimes people who are potentially dangerous are kept in workhouses rather than into asylums, and he was held there for a while and then was released. Now, this was in 1891 he was released, having been held there for a couple of years, where apparently he attacked two women, but he wasn't particularly violent. In fact, he stabbed him in the bum, basically. Stabbed him in the backside, was rearrested by the police and was taken away. He was then reincarcerated as being potentially dangerous because of this action, but it wasn't real knife violence that the Ripper was associated with. But what made Cutbush interesting was that in the reports in the press suggested that the police may have knowledge of the identity of the Ripper. This was like a follow-up interview they had with him following the Cutbush, because Cutbush was put forward as being potentially the Ripper, but it was quite clear from what he did that wasn't the case. He wasn't that kind of a killer. He wasn't even a killer, actually.
Yeah, but the thing about Cutbush there, Andy, is I think one of the reasons why he makes such a attractive suspect is because, if I'm not mistaken, he was a medical student at one time, correct?
He had studied medicine at some point, yes.
And he might have also had syphilis, which kind of gives the motive why he would be attacking prostitutes.
Yes.
Because it leads by assumption that he may have contracted syphilis from a prostitute, so he committed these horrible crimes to get back at them because they ruined his, medical mind or what have you.
Absolutely. What the most interesting element is that that was kind of fitting with that previous notion of medical involvement of the Ripper, medical knowledge of the Ripper, which is unlikely to have been the case, but it's keeping that theme. But certainly the fact that McNaughton himself spoke about Cutbush and saying this is the reason why I don't think it is, because we had suspicions essentially of who the Ripper was. It was the very first time anywhere in the public domain that the idea that the police had any idea of the Ripper's identity was actually revealed. And that's interesting, how little information of genuine information was being passed out by the police into the public, because I think the problem was that the press were on one side and the police were on the other side. They were kind of closing ranks almost against the press because the press were giving them such a hard time. So it's interesting that it emerges as being a possibility that the police actually knew something more than that was actually realised at the time. And this is only 94, so it's only a few years after the Ripper murders had stopped. I think by 1894, all would agree that the Ripper murders had finished. I mean, as early as 1891, or as late as 1891, I should say, a particular murder that was identified as being potentially the Ripper's was considered, but has been dismissed now in modern times, if you like, but at the time. But that was the last one that was reattributed to him. So by 1894, everyone was pretty sure that for whatever reason, the Ripper murders had stopped. So the idea that Cutbush kind of partially fitted the identity was present, if you like, because he had been violent and had been possibly of unsound mind, but the fact he was kind of stabbing people in the backside rather than sort of the violence of the Ripper suggested it was unlikely he was the Ripper, because you said before, you don't go from that kind of violent murder to another kind of murder or just sort of calm down and act normally. It just doesn't happen. But the important thing, as I say, was more the fact that McNaughton was identifying that there was potentially the police had an idea who the Ripper was. The next person who really kind of falls into the frame is worth talking about a little bit about, because it does finally bring us into a bit of a paranormal element of this story. Thankfully there is one, as I did promise at the beginning. There was a chap called Dr. Donston, or Rosalind Donston, had come into the police's eye, if you like, during the Ripper murders time, because he actually accused a junior doctor of being the Ripper. He actually told the police he believed this was the Ripper. Now, there was no evidence whatsoever about this junior doctor as being the Ripper, but the police themselves were intrigued by Donston's behaviour and thought he was a little odd himself, and they did investigate him for a while, but it showed that he was unlikely to have been involved in the murder, so he kind of just disappeared off the horizon. But a few years later, he popped up again. He's working with a woman called Victoria Kramers in the going to the perfume industry, but they also have links with theosophists and occultists of the time. The late 1800s was the real high point of spiritualism and the rise of the Golden Dawn, which is an esoteric organisation that had become very popular at this point. So you were the real zenith of spiritualism. So anyone kind of moving in those sorts of circles would meet very interesting people. Now, it appears that Dr. Donston, he was calling himself a doctor, he wasn't actually a doctor trained at all, he was telling Victoria Kramers that he knew who the Ripper was, and that he actually owned the blood-stained neckties of the Ripper, and that they'd come into his possession. Now, interesting enough, those neckties passed from him to Aleister Crowley, who's a name you might recognise, may have heard of before, which he's a man of dubious reputation. Now, as someone myself interested in the occult, he's not quite as bad as people paint him to be. He was very much a sensationalist. He liked sort of publicity of any kind, no matter what it was, no matter how bad it might be. He just loved it. He used to call himself the Beast, and he was seen as being a rather unpleasant chap. But that was his public face. Privately, he was a bit different to that. But he liked notoriety. Now, he actually claimed that the murders themselves are part of a black magic ritual that the Ripper was performing to achieve the ability of becoming invisible, which sounds completely insane. Now, he said himself that he didn't actually believe this story, that it was Victoria Kramers who told him this particular story, and probably came from Dr. Donston. So you have got that first time this kind of mystery, occult, conspiracy angle coming into it. And this is only the 1890s, so it's fairly soon after the murders. And Crowley himself said he didn't really believe the story, but this is the story he was told. So you've already, even this early on, got this kind of supernatural angle being added into it. Any thoughts? Sorry.
No. I was just listening. Just pause right here for 1 second, because I do want to bring up a little bit later when we talk about other, more far-fetched culprits, or people that they assume might have been the suspects. Helena Blavatsky was actually mentioned at one time because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle advanced these theories about female murderers. So I'll just touch on that a little bit later. But no, that's perfect. Where you're going?
Actually, we could do that now. We can say that again.
Right.
Go for it.
Yeah. So speaking of the idea of the occult being behind this, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he had advanced several theories, and one of the theories involved a female murderer, sometimes dubbed Jill the Ripper. Now, over time, many women were proposed as the Ripper, the killer, and one of these people happened to be Helena Blavatsky, one of the Theosophists. We're going to have to get that. Theosophist, right? Yeah.
That's it.
Theosophist. Yes. Put that in there somehow. But, she was, her name was actually raised as being a possible Ripper suspect. And I'm wondering how that was taken, how well that was taken to heart. Was this something that was just, tabloid trash? Or was this, fitting into that whole idea of, esoteric knowledge being used in order to make the Ripper killer invincible or invisible, whichever way you look at it?
It's one of those lines of inquiry that does open up, certainly in much more recent times. The Blavatsky story itself is much more of a more recent duration. Certainly, as Donston had his links to the Theosophists as well, which of course is Blavatsky's organisation. So that kind of blurs in with that. And it's something I'm definitely going to get on to in a little while, because there is a point in this history of the Ripper suspects where things do go a bit silly. There are some very silly theories, but the kind of crazy part, if you like, that was sparked by a particular accusation about who the Ripper might have been that came out in the 1970s. So we will get to that. But yeah, I mean, anyone who was kind of strange, shall we say, could be fitted up as being the Ripper, because it would fit into this idea of the Ripper must be a strange person, must have magical powers, or he could avoid the police and keep disappearing, hiding away. So people who are involved in the occult might know this, might have these powers, and they could be turning people invisible and hiding away. So you do get kind of almost frontline people, kind of in the know, in the public eye, kind of people getting the finger pointed at. I mean, another figure in more recent history that's been identified as potentially the Ripper was the artist Walter Sickert, because he used to cut up bodies and horses for his art to learn how they actually worked, and suggested that he may have gone a bit too far with his examination of the human body and started to cut up women in order to find out how they worked for his artwork. Now, Walter Sickert's life is well documented. There's no sign of him being in the area at the right time. There's no real chance that he might might have been interested in committing those kinds of murders. Because again, you've got that same thing about here's someone giving a motive for why the murders were happening, because he wanted to figure out how the human body worked. But you don't need a motive. That's that thing of here's a motive, there's a person who might be responsible. So Walter Sickert, the artist, kind of fits in that same model of being someone who was doing stuff that was a little unusual. His art, some of his art has got a very dark, sinister tone to it. There's no doubt about it. There's a particular painting that those who propose Sickert as the Ripper point to that looks a little bit like Mary Jane Kelly's room, with a woman sitting on the bed looking down. Her face is kind of hidden in shadow. That they've suggested this was him painting her before he killed her. And I think it's Patricia Cornwell, American crime fiction writer, who's the person who put a lot of effort into the idea of Walter Sickert. I think it's, I must admit, I'm not entirely certain, but I'm fairly sure it's her who put Sickert up. So, people who might have been involved in nefarious activity of some kind or other may well have been framed up for being the Ripper because of the awful nature of the murders, and the idea of the occult and human sacrifice and that kind of stuff is juicy gossip for the news press, unfortunately.
But the idea of a woman being responsible seems implausible for me, because there would require a bit of strength to do these types of killings. Bodies would have been moved, or even if they were not moved, to come up behind somebody and have enough strength to cut through the various parts of the neck, as you said. I mean, this requires masculine strength. Do you see it that way as well, too? Do you think that there's no chance that a woman was responsible for these killings?
Absolutely. I don't see it at all. Certainly looking at the psychology behind that kind of mutilations is definitely suggestive of a man who was probably abused as a child, certainly was dominated by a female presence, probably mother, less likely a grandparent or elder sibling, but most likely a mother, who had her own internal rages and often would meet those out on their child, the son, and trying to dehumanize a woman was almost like trying to get revenge on what was done to him by his mother. So it certainly points in that general direction. There are rare cases where there have been female serial killers who have targeted men for the same reason. There was Charlize Theron played her in a film a few years ago, and I completely forget the name of the film, but that was a female serial killer who was picking on men for the same kind of reason, that it was sort of dehumanizing the man because of a male figure had been horrendously bad to her in her childhood years. So, psychology, it points towards it being a man because, again, as you say quite right, the physical strength required. I mean, they were almost decapitations, in single blows, cutting through the spinal cord. That takes an awful lot of force. You could certainly say someone in a psychotic rage, male or female, potentially has that kind of strength, but it tends to be men who do that kind of thing, I have to be honest with you.
Now, what about the possibility of a man who was wronged by a prostitute, which is, this is a theory as well, too, and got some sort of venereal disease from his contact with a prostitute? Is this a possibility? I personally am going in the same line of reasoning that you're going as well, that there is so much violence involved that this is something that was long-standing. This is something that became part of who the person was, and not just, you contracted syphilis, now you want to get back at somebody that, gave you a venereal disease. But that has been proposed a good bit of the time to think that this is one of the reasons why there was such animosity directed for this particular segment of the population. Again,
yes, it's possible, except it's falling into that same trap of trying to find a logical explanation. A reasonable, rational explanation that the average Joe public can understand. The woman's giving me syphilis, I'll take revenge on her for giving me syphilis. Now, the trouble is, syphilis caught early is easy to cure, so why would you bother going out and trying to kill every prostitute you ever come across, because in case you might manage to kill the one that gave it to you? If it develops, you just go insane, basically. You're not going to start becoming a violent psychotic killer. You just literally lose all contact with reality. I mean, rather famously, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche may well have had syphilis, and that probably what drove him bananas in the end. Not that he was having sex with prostitutes. He was a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War, and may have caught it from the patients he was helping when he was a young doctor, helping in the medical profession. So, he didn't necessarily catch it from a prostitute, but certainly he drove him insane. And you completely snap with reality. You lose it totally. You don't become a violent psychotic killer. You simply lose contact with reality, because by definition, a psychopath killer is not insane. They have internal logic to what they're doing. They haven't completely lost their marbles. So it's unlikely, but it was a fairly common theme because it was known that syphilis causes insanity. It's also a kind of a moral thing of you must have lived an immoral life to contract syphilis, therefore you must be a bad person. Anyway, you see that kind of Victorian prudery comes into it. Again, that kind of notion of this is almost like a punishment for your naughtiness. So...
And the Dripper also becomes a bit of a boogeyman, doesn't he? He is there as a warning to anybody that if you would happen to veer off to the side street and indulge your lust, that you could become a Jack the Ripper as well, too. I think that that's part of the scenario going there as well, too. This is a personification of all the kind of evil that is in the world, and that's the evil that's in the human being, that you can become a monster if you allow that monster to overtake you.
Absolutely, that is very much the case. It's one of those things that Charles Dickens, who was writing his novels around about the same time, was trying to highlight in a lot of his writings, the deprivation and the poor squalor of the East End. And basically, Jack the Ripper did exactly that for everybody. He absolutely highlighted the state of the East End of London, how dreadful it was because of the murders. He really brought that to the public's attention. So if you want to argue there was an upside of the Ripper, that is one, that he really did start to change the way the country viewed the East End of London, because it's like the heart of the capital of the British Empire, had this air of incredible squalor and vile nastiness, basically, that the Ripper actually succeeded doing what Charles Dickens had been trying to do for decades. He actually did it in a matter of a couple of months.
That's right. You don't even have to read a play to get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely.
Now, what about, you had said that these murders usually end because somebody was incarcerated or somebody died. Now, yes. Andy, what is the possibility that these murders ended because somebody actually moved to another country? Is that plausible to you?
Absolutely not. I have to say, not at all. First and foremost, I have no doubt, and those who are serious about this have no doubt, that the killer was someone who lived locally, who was a poor immigrant. There wasn't someone of any kind of financial means, so that money to travel abroad just wouldn't be there. It's expensive today, but you imagine what it was like in those days. You'd have, or maybe your entire lifetime living in East End London, it wouldn't be enough to get a ticket to America or anything like that. And there are no murders of these similar kinds that happened soon afterwards in other parts of the world. This killer would not have stopped. He would have carried on. There's no doubt about it. He would have carried on killing the way he was killing. Those murders would have continued somewhere else in the world. And there was simply no evidence of murders of that kind occurring soon after they stopped in November 1888.
Unless, of course, it's a rich person, and that's what a lot of people rally around as well, too.
Yeah.
That the Jack the Ripper was a rich person, he was a man of means. Now, by making a rich person a suspect, does that take a bit of the a little bit off of the poor population? Does it then shift your focus on the powers that were suppressing these people? See, in my mind, it does. It almost becomes a morality play. So by pointing your finger at the rich, you say, these are the people that are responsible for our station in life, and these are the people that are preying upon us, essentially. So, yes, I agree again with you. I mean, who could not agree with you? You have all of your facts. You're like a walking Ripper encyclopedia, whether that's good or bad,
I have no idea.
I think the jury's still out on that one. But I think, but again, it's attractive to think that somebody who is in the upper echelon of society is the one that has all these kind of problems. People even bandied about the idea that somebody in the royal family was the Ripper, and that's the reason why the killing stopped, and that's the reason why somebody could stay hidden, and that's the reason why somebody was never implicated into these murders. But I think that it makes a point, again, looking at who we are as human beings. It's kind of a catharsis to think that somebody outside of our station in life is doing this to us, rather than the poor sod that lives down the block.
Yeah, no, I understand that entirely. It kind of feeds into that narrative of it's them against us, isn't it? That this person is rich and is coming down to our part of the world, killing our people and going off and being protected and hidden. It's a kind of anti-romantic notion. I would say romantic notion, but that's not really romantic at all. It's like an anti-romantic notion, and unfortunately it's complete garbage.
That's right. And I think whenever you talked about Dickens, I think a lot of that does have to do with Dickens, because he is writing about this same particular area right around this same time period, a couple decades earlier for A Christmas Carol. But he deals with very black and white, doesn't he? He deals with the rich and the poor. So when you're dealing with that kind of a lifestyle that was in the East End, you did have your haves and your have-nots, and the chasm was so wide that the have-nots, it was, virtually impossible to go across that gulf to, become, one of the people that were rich. So to blame the rich, I think, is a logical point of view to take, especially on the people that are being preyed upon.
Yes, I take your point entirely there. But we can move back onto the real path to the Ripper. Because it's interesting, it comes back to what we just said before about, why did it stop? There really is only those two alternatives. The Ripper has to die or has to be incarcerated, or both, obviously. There are... I know that American particular names have been put forward as being the Ripper, that people did these murders and then went back to the States and carried out murders. Francis Tumblety is a name that's popped up fairly recently, and H.H. Holmes is another one. H.H. Holmes, I think, was being dragged in purely for publicity reasons, because I think that it's an interesting story in itself, and I think it gets it out a bit more, suggesting that H.H. Holmes might be the Ripper. The Tumblety one, again, I can see why people are saying that, but again, there's no murders of those kinds happening in America. They use them responsible for some murders, but not those kind of sadistic, violent murders that we were seeing. So
that's an interesting point, because Tumblety actually, he grew up not very far from where I am right now. And after the Ripper murders ended, he actually came to Pittsburgh, where he worked in a brothel as a doctor that treated venereal diseases. So it does it makes a very interesting character, let's put it that way. And there are stories that, he was one of these self-proclaimed doctors, that he actually made it to the Lincoln administration just on reputation alone, but he had no medical background whatsoever. He was basically a snake oil salesman, and he plied his wares over the streets of London. But he was actually questioned as a Ripper suspect in London, if I'm not mistaken. But soon after the Ripper murders ended, he ends up down in Pittsburgh working in a brothel, like I said, as a doctor that treated venereal diseases. Now, again, he was one of these guys that was claimed to hold a collection of body parts. There was word that he had a jar full of women's vaginas, and however he got that, whatever. But it's all these kind of very macabre and very kind of morbid type of evidence that surrounds this particular individual. But there really is not any kind of killings that are listed in western Pennsylvania, or even in eastern Pennsylvania, whenever he would disembark in Philadelphia, or probably in New York. But these Ripper murders ended in Whitechapel. You don't see these same exact murders happening in western Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
Or
that's
in Missouri, or New York City, or anything like that. Yeah.
That's exactly what you'd expect to see. If he worked in a brothel, you start finding prostitutes ripped to pieces in that brothel, because the Ripper had no kind of worries about being found or stopped at that point. It was just simply getting that vicarious pleasure that he could get out of killing these people. So, but it brings us back to that question: what is it that stops the Ripper? And you can't get away from the fact that we are bogged down quite often with the idea of trying to figure out a motive, because we think there should be a motive, because those at the time thought there was going to have to be a motive, and those who aren't totally clued up on how human psychology works think there has to be a rational motive, and there just isn't one. So you are left with this question: well, he's not going to stop unless something's stopped him, i.e. imprisonment or death. Which brings us back to the next time the Ripper kind of appears, or information of the Ripper starts to appear in the press again. In 1895, a supposed witness of the Ripper in 1888 is interviewed by a magazine, a chap called Granger, who claims to have seen the Ripper at the time, and it appears he may well have been a witness to one of the murders, or at least in the immediate area of the murders, but claimed he was still seeing the same person 7 years later in Liverpool Street Station. Now, the press themselves thought that was highly unlikely, but wrote an article about it. But what was interesting in the article, published for the first time, was words from a chap called Donald Swanson, who at the time was the head of the CIA, CID even.
Getting back, come full circle now.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just do that bit again. It appeared in the press for the first time that Donald Swanson, who was then head of the CID in 1888, was in charge overall of the Jack the Ripper case. Actually, he was in charge. It was the first time that had appeared in print, but also it stated that the murderer, Jack the Ripper, had been arrested and had died soon afterwards. So it was the first hint in the press, really the one who was really in charge of the case overall, and that the police rather had a definite idea of who the Ripper was, and that person was dead, which fits in what we've already been talking about. It was interesting. This is the real time that there's a real hint that the police knew who the Ripper was, or at least had a very good idea about his identity. That goes on a bit further because a former prison governor by the name of Major Griffiths, who was friend of the CID at the time, including Swanson, actually goes even further and lists 3 people. Now, there's no names mentioned at this point, but he gives a list of 3 people that the police had very definite suspicions that one of these 3 was the Ripper. The names, I say, are withheld, but he does give us information, a little bit of information about who these people are. The first one, it says, is a Polish Jew who was at large during the murder time, who was identified by a police officer in the area of Mitre Square at the time of the murder. That who was not actually captured at that point, but was identified by a police officer. He said the second person that he believed could be the Ripper, this is again with inside information from the CID, was a Russian doctor who was in hiding in London in 1888. He was believed to have gone mad from syphilis, there's that syphilis again, and was thought to have carried knives around. The third person he mentioned was a mad English doctor, so doctors are getting a bit of a bash in here, who was found in the Thames having committed suicide around December the 31st, 1888. That he was believed quite strongly that one of these 3 people was the actual Ripper. So it's real indications now that the police did have a fairly good idea about who they thought the Ripper was. It was one of these 3 suspects. So you see, the case itself is actually looking like it could be solvable. In actual,
now, is suicide, though, an option for somebody such as the Jack the Ripper murderer?
This gets into the more interesting areas of the human psychology again. It's unlikely, very unlikely, because a psychopath doesn't necessarily think what they're doing is wrong, at the very least, or doesn't care, more likely. They're unlikely to suddenly decide, oh, I'm a bad person, I've done all these horrible murders, I'm going to kill myself. It never happened. It just does not happen that way, you know. There's no occasion where identified serial killer has then committed suicide, other than if they're actually completely incarcerated. Now, there are people we know, for example, Fred West, who was over here, committed suicide, as did the doctor, the genuine doctor who actually murdered a lot of his patients. They did commit suicide, but again, they were different kinds of killers. They weren't this kind of violent psychopathic killer. So they don't have this sudden moment of rational realization that they're a bad person and kill themselves. So it doesn't rule this third one out, the English doctor who committed suicide, but it seems less likely. Indeed, it goes on a bit further because they say the third person, who again isn't named, that the family believed he may well have been involved in the Ripper murders. Again, no explanation as to why. This is a kind of very vague stuff from Major Griffiths, but it's a hint. Indeed, a writer called G.R. Sims, who was a journalist at the time, also stated that the killer, Jack the Ripper, had actually killed himself or had died in the Thames fairly soon after the ending of the murders. So there is this leaning towards the idea that they not only do they have an idea who it might be, but also that the person himself may well have died fairly soon afterwards. Indeed, it goes even further. In 1903, Frederick Aberline, who was the person most in charge on the ground, if you like, the day-to-day investigation of the Ripper murder. In fact, Frederick Aberline was a guy that was played by Michael Caine in a TV version of the Ripper story a few years ago. The programme made him appear to have been much more directly involved in the investigation than he actually was, but he was in charge on the ground, and he actually talks about the Ripper in his sort of memoirs, having retired from the police, and he mentions that he thinks that the Ripper was a person who was removing the organs and taking them away to sell them to medical students, which was a theory put forward at the time that was dismissed because, first and foremost, you didn't have to buy medical organs. You could actually acquire them quite legally, quite easily for free from hospitals if you're researching as a medical student. So there's no reason on earth why this person would murder to steal to sell organs. There's no one who'd buy them because they don't have to buy them. But so it suggested he didn't really have a lot of a clue of what was really going on. But he did make reference to the fact that there was a strong theory in the police that the man had died in an asylum, that the real Ripper died in an asylum. That he didn't think this person was the Ripper because he thought it was the guy selling the organs. But he was saying that the police believed the Ripper had died. Not only was he dead, but he died in an asylum, which points back possibly to the first two guys, possibly more likely to be the first one of the three that Major Griffiths lists, the Polish Jew who was at large and captured afterwards. So again, is bit by bit, we're kind of starting to see emerging a real theory as to who the Ripper might actually be, that the police may well have known more than they were given credit for. Because, as I say, the press weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in beating the hell out, basically, of the police and giving them a hard time. Indeed, in 1907, Dr. Robert Anderson, who was the head of CID the following year from 1889 onwards, and was Swanson's boss, who I mentioned earlier, Swanson being the first person being identified as being directly overall charge of the case. Robert Anderson was his immediate boss above him. So obviously he had an idea what was going on. Though he didn't take up the post until 1889, he believed that the Ripper had been caged in an asylum, to use his own words directly, and that he believed that the Ripper was a poor Polish Jew. So again, it's starting to lean in that direction of, we've got two real possibilities here. We've got the drowned English doctor starting to emerge as being a possibility, or we have this poor Polish Jew living in the area as being the Ripper, who was having problems psychologically. Any thoughts?
Well, that leads me to the pivotal question I have for you, my friend, is if you would put your money down, who are you going to claim is Jack the Ripper without any kind of hesitation, without any kind of wavering? Yes, tell us who you feel is indeed Jack the Ripper.
One of these two.
One of these two. Okay.
I'll get there in the end. I will get there because I want to build this.
It sounds
case
like you're
up.
equivocating, my friend.
I'll keep our audience gripped to the end. Now,
that's right.
Interestingly, Anderson actually goes even further in his own memoirs. The indication that he believed that the Ripper was caged in an asylum was in like a newspaper version, but in his actual memoirs themselves, he actually says the following, which is really quite interesting: that he believed that this is one of those cases where, in English law, we didn't have basically sufficient evidence to convict this person, but we were convinced this was the Ripper. In fact, the only witness who actually had a very good look at the Ripper identified this guy as being the Ripper, but refused to actually testify who it was because he was a fellow Jew. So again, it's indication of being Jew. So we have a definite indication that Major Griffith's three suspects I mentioned before could well be one of those three, certainly the first or the third person. The middle one, which is the Russian doctor, we'll get back to because that one's a little strange. So we have changes within the police force. In 1913, Sir Mervyn Macnaughton then retires. Now, he was overall head of the CID. He was like the big honcho at the top. He's again has some indication that he too has more information about it, but he hasn't put anything in the press yet about what he believes to be the case regarding the Ripper. But he has been asked, and he was writing his own memoirs, and I'll come back to him because we have some more interesting theories coming forward. Again, the idea of the Ripper being a doctor. One of the people who identified themselves as having information was a psychic by the name of Robert James Lees. Now, Robert Lees himself was someone who he claimed the police would turn to occasionally for assistance with cases that they couldn't solve. That classic kind of, the psychic who has information to help the police. He claimed that there was a secret tribunal that was held over a Dr. Thomas Mason, who apparently was showing violent tendencies and was going out as a doctor and was committing these murders. That the person that he believed this Thomas Mason was, his wife held a senior position in Queen Victoria's court. So this person had links, so his wife had links to Queen Elizabeth's sort of inner circle. So you get this first time, this kind of indication that maybe there's something behind the idea that the Ripper has some kind of royal links. Now, I should emphasise that this Robert James Lee story appears in a newspaper. It's not Lee himself saying this, it's just that this has been attributed to Robert James Lee. It turns out, and the reason I mention that, is that Lees himself made no such claims. This has all been made up by the press. In the 1930s, this was happening. But you see already leaking into the press this idea of this royal connection. Really, for the first time, there's any kind of indication that there's some theories that involve the royal family, or at least people involved with the royal family are actually part of the Ripper story. But there's no truth to it. Lees himself didn't claim any of this. In actual fact, a bit of digging by one of the researchers discovered that this report came from a newspaper in America, your lot, who've made this claim that Robert Lees had connections, had identified this person who had connections with the royal family, but there was no truth to the story whatsoever. So that was really where the Ripper story lay until after the Second World War, because things, you know, as you imagine, things got rather sort of a bit difficult over here for us during that kind of period of time, and researching the Ripper became very, very much less important. But what does happen after the war is the emergence of Sir Mervyn Macnaghten, the guy I mentioned earlier, his memoirs and then his own documents on the case. Now, Macnaghten actually wrote about this Thomas Cutbush we were talking about earlier on. He actually made a direct reference to that guy, said that here is a list of the reasons why this Thomas Cutbush person is not the Ripper. There's no way. But he then names 3 people who he believes is the Ripper. This is the first time this has actually appeared in the public domain, as it were. And I'm just going to grab my list because I'll put it down somewhere. I want to read this exactly. This is the 3 names that belong to the people that this Major Griffiths had listed in the article I was talking about before. These are the 3 people. First one, Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor of good family, 41 years old, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, that's Mary Jane Kelly, whose body, which is said to have been in the Thames for upwards of a month, was found in the Thames on the 3rd of December, or about 6 weeks after the murder. He was believed to be sexually insane, whatever that means, and from private information, there was little doubt that his own family believed him to be the murderer. Number 2, Kosminski, or Kosmansky, slightly different spelling each time, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man was believed to have gone insane through solitary vices, whatever that means, and had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum in March 1889. This man strongly resembled the man the city police saw near Mitre Square. You remember I mentioned that earlier on about this man being seen near Mitre Square?
I do.
And there are many circumstances connected with this man that made him a strong suspect. Number 3, Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. Subsequently to what? It doesn't say. After the murders? Don't know. This man's antecedents, i.e. criminal record, were of the worst type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. Now this is, I say, Macnaghten's own memorandum on file, which became available. So he's named 3 people as being possibly the Ripper. The first one was M.J. Druitt, the doctor. Second one was Kosminski, Kaminsky, or Kosmansky, the variations of the spelling, and Michael Ostrog, which is the Russian doctor we were talking about before. So these are the 3 names that very clearly the police had strong suspicions about all 3 as potentially being the Ripper. But there was a problem with this document. It emerged in 1959, very much genuine, but trying to find the people that were listed has proved to be very difficult, initially at least. The guy who actually uncovered the documents is a guy called Daniel Farson, who used to be a reporter and was a TV personality, like he was sort of one of the first TV stars. He had to accept what Macnaghten was saying, because it was many years later, that Macnaghten himself believed that, number 1, the M.J. Druitt to be the most likely suspect, as to be the Ripper. However, he found problems when he tried to find more information about M.J. Druitt, and he discovered that in actual fact that M.J. Druitt's name was Montague John Druitt. There was nobody who was born in the right year to have been 41 years old, but if you take that back to 31 years old, he found him. The guy he found was not a doctor at all, was actually a teacher, a school teacher. He'd trained to be a lawyer, but had failed in that and become a teacher. M.J. Druitt's own family had associations with doctors and lawyers, so that might be where the confusion came from. But there was no sign of him on the death register for 1888, no sign of him at all. So if he had committed suicide on the 3rd of December, it wasn't recorded. It was only when he moved on to 1889 that he found M.J. Druitt. He'd actually drowned in the Thames on the 31st of December 1888. So it was only recorded in 1889's register, because he obviously found the following day. So there were problems, there were holes in that story, but he was convinced, Dan Farson was convinced, that McNaughton was probably right, that this was most likely to be the victim. Although, actually, another point, McNaughton actually notes the possibility that number 2 may well have been the Ripper rather than number 1, but Farson had to go along with what Norton was basically saying, because McNaughton was the man who was there at the time. So, from as early as 1889, the police clearly had very good ideas who they thought the Ripper was. It was one of these 3 people. As I say, Farson was trying to identify M.J. Jewett and found there were problems and inconsistencies in McNaughton's version of the man's life, but he found him. He spoke to the family, and there were, or he didn't speak to the family, there were the records of the family suggested that they thought perhaps he was mentally unwell. There was a suicide note that he found in M.J. Jewett's lodgings. He'd recently been fired from his post as a teacher. The suggestion was that there may well have been homosexual links with him and possibly pupils. He was a secondary school older kids teacher and may have been fired for that reason. But the suicide note said that he felt he was going like mother. Now, his mother was a clinical depressive. She was on medication with depression, hadn't seen counselling and therapy and that sort of thing, and had made no difference. So it suggests he was afraid he was becoming depressed like mother. Now, someone with heavy depression can certainly commit suicide. So that kind of fits more with him having had depression and committed suicide because of depression, not that he was the Ripper. How he becomes caught up with the notion that he might be Jack the Ripper itself is a bit of a mystery, because all you have is someone committing suicide around about the end of December. So the thinking, I think the thinking is, well, the Ripper's decided to kill himself because he realizes he's a bad person, which, as we said before, I just don't think it's the case. It just doesn't happen that way. But that seems to be how he was drawn into the notion that he was Jack the Ripper, because of the fact that he committed suicide, been fired from a job. You know, that kind of suggesting he might be. I mean, I'm kind of second-guessing McNaughton as to why he listed M.J. Jewett as being his number 1 person on his list. Now, I don't think we can say that this was an order of preference, 1, 2 and 3. It was just these are the 3 suspects that were thought to have real validity as being the Ripper. That was the last time for a while that serious proper research was being done, because there's an article that gets published by Dr. Thomas Stowell, who basically changes the landscape of Jack the Ripper's investigation forever and turns it into the ridiculous 3-ring circus it becomes, because he claims, with very little evidence, that the Jack the Ripper was actually Queen Elizabeth's eldest grandson, Prince Albert Victor. He claims, this is Dr. Thomas Stowell, that Albert Victor had syphilis, had contracted it and was out, basically as a loony, out in the streets of the East End of London, going around murdering prostitutes, and was only stopped when the physician in ordinary, which is the personal doctor of the Queen, Dr. William Gull, went out to look for him and find him and take him back to Buckingham Palace, where he would be kept locked away until the next time he escaped and carried out more murders. Now, as you can imagine, the idea of the Ripper being someone in the royal family absolutely exploded across the world. This is the 1970s we got to by this point, and it really did capture the imagination of the public, as you can imagine. And the idea of the Ripper being linked with the royals might turn this, as I say, into from a serious investigation into a genuine identity into a complete freak show, basically, unfortunately.
Yeah, the first time I ever heard about this person being a suspect was in the 1970s. I think it was something off of like maybe In Search Of, and it was a program here in America that brought this link up to the royal family. But my question always was, how much working knowledge would the royal family have of the East End at this time?
Absolutely none at all.
Well, so, I would think that he's not really going to be able to navigate the streets of the East End at 3 o'clock in the morning very well.
Absolutely. And I think he might have been noticed, someone who clearly had the money, would be noticed as wandering around as a bit of a... Imagine somebody dressed very different to the people in the East End and walking around babbling loony because he was suffering from syphilis, and it drives you insane. It doesn't turn you into a serial killer. It just doesn't make any sense. But the whole story started to fall apart very quickly. First of all, there was absolutely no evidence that Prince Albert Victor ever had syphilis. He did die young of influenza, that's a definite, but more importantly, he was never in the area at the time of the murders. And one day, he was in Scotland. They were entertaining, I think it was the Norwegian royal family at the time, And there was more than 100 witnesses that said he was there in Scotland on the night of one of the murders. It is total nonsense, but yet, unfortunately, it opens up the door to all the silly theories that will come along later on. You know, Dr. Stahl himself, they published an article in a magazine called The Criminologist. He actually died within a week or two of it being published. Purely by chance, he's just old age. But you even had then, you have people saying, oh no, he was murdered for revealing the truth about Jack the Ripper. Yeah, of course he was. It's like, come on, you know.
Yeah.
Now, this, as I say, this really does open up the door to sillier theories, and then, you know, the height of silliness starts to really develop with this, because, as I said before, we have that weird Jewess spelling, the idea of Freemasons being involved, the J-U-W-E-S, as supposedly linked to Freemasonry. Now, in actual fact, if you do a bit digging into Freemasonry, there's no reference to Jews being spelt this way. It just seems to be whoever wrote it on the wall couldn't spell Jews properly. But this Freemason connection starts to really play its part with a theory/story invented by a chap called Joseph Gorman, who'd actually started calling himself Joseph Sickett. Do you remember I mentioned Walter Sickett earlier? This guy claims to be the illegitimate son of Walter Sickett. Now, Joe Gorman himself is actually a paint restorer living in Camden, so the idea to link himself up with Walter Sickett would make sense for business purposes, but he starts to invent the most ridiculous story imaginable. So, as well as claiming to be the son of Walter Sickett, he also claims his grandmother had a liaison with Prince Albert. There's that good old Prince Albert Victor again coming back into it, that in actual fact that they had an illegitimate child, which is his grandmother. He claims there was a secret marriage between Prince Albert Victor and his grandmother, and that secret marriage was discovered by the royal family, and they ordered that the woman who was the woman he's supposed to have married, Annie Elizabeth Crook, be taken off the lunacy asylum and locked away. But apparently Miss Crook tells the story of what's happened to a Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly, of course, being the last Ripper victim, and she tells other friends of hers, fellow prostitutes, in actual fact this is the true story, that Prince Albert Victor has actually had an illegitimate son who's actually legitimate, and this child should be heir to the throne. Sir William Gull, Prince Albert Victor's doctor, discovers the truth about this secret marriage and the baby, and orders, along with his, is ordered with his friend Lord Salisbury, who are both Freemasons, to go out and kill the prostitutes who have this secret knowledge, to make sure the prostitutes are killed in such a manner that they would know that they've been killed Masonic style, whichever the hell that's supposed to mean, and that, in actual fact, that's what happens. These women are murdered to hide the truth about this illegitimate or legitimate child who could be heir to the throne. Now, first and foremost, his grandmother, this chap's grandmother, isn't killed. You know, she's put in an asylum, so you know, why not bump her off? The daughter that this woman gives birth to isn't. This is Joe Gorman's illegitimate mother. She isn't killed. You know, she's happy to live along. Now, she would be, according to Joe Gorman's story, Joe Sickett's story, she would be, and therefore he would be, in line to the throne. But these people were allowed to live. But the prostitutes who knew the story are murdered. It doesn't make sense, does it?
It makes no sense, no. None at all.
But, unfortunately, the story is believed completely by a writer called Stephen Knight, who writes a book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, which outlines this ludicrous story of Joseph Gorman Sickett's supposed fact that he's descended from the throne, descended from the crown. It is a massive seller, worldwide seller, as you can well imagine, this kind of a story. I mean, this is even better than the other one about Albert Victor being insane and suffering from syphilis. This is Albert Victor having a secret marriage, and that the marriage results in a child that is really the heir to the throne, but those who know about it are being bumped off Masonic style. I mean, it's just complete fantasy. And Joe Gorman Sickett actually admits he made the whole thing up. But it doesn't stop the story spreading even further and being turned into films. I mean, if you've ever seen, now, I must admit, Alan Moore fully admits it's a fictitious story that's based on the Joe Sickett story. But the film From Hell is essentially based on that story about the illegitimate child and the marriage. Again, a very popular film. It has, Alan Moore himself says this is not reality whatsoever, but there are people out there who totally believe this story is true. Absolutely believe this is the real reality of the story.
Well, Johnny Depp's in it. What's not to believe?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, very much so.
But that's interesting, though, because we learn so much from the mainstream media. So movies do become our reality after a while. So really, that's what's so fascinating about this particular show, is that it took 4 hours to wade through all the mythos around this one character to kind of get to the actual pulse of who this person was and what made him tick. But yeah, I mean, there's movies out there all over the place. Whenever you talked about the link to the royal family, I remember they made a made-for-TV movie back here in the United States in the late 1970s, and he was actually driven around the East End by coach, and whenever he found the particular prostitute he was looking for, he would just simply knock on the door. The coach driver would halt. He would go out there and do his thing, and then they would whisk him right back to the palace afterwards.
Absolutely, that's the kind of thing that's based on these various versions of the story. That you can weave all sorts of patterns. And one of the things I often complain about is, as I say, I'm going to outline in a minute. I think this case is solvable. It is, there is very, very good evidence to point towards one particular suspect, but a lot of people in the sort of Jack the Ripper world don't want that. They don't want the case solved, because that ends, all the speculation, all the stories, all the books, and all the films that can be made. You don't want that taken away. You want the mystery to remain, even if you can almost certainly build a pretty good case against one particular suspect, because that's what starts to happen. Now, Anderson, I was talking about before, this is getting back to the reality of the murders, who really it was. I said before, we have McNaughton outlining those 3 suspects, which I'll just quickly go over again, which is M.J. Druitt, who turns out to be a 31-year-old teacher, not a 41-year-old doctor. We have Kosminski, Kaminsky, or Kosmansky, various spellings, a Polish Jew living in the area who is definitely violent, hatred of women. And then the mysterious Michael Ostrog, the Russian doctor and convict. Those being the 3 most likely, by far, the people who are responsible. Now, one of the other senior officers also writes his memoirs of his life as senior CID. Dr. Robert Anderson, who was Swanson's immediate boss, so the guy above Swanson I mentioned before, who was the guy who was top in charge of the case. This is his boss above. In his own book, he writes that they have suspicions about who the Ripper was, and Anderson actually claims that the suspect was the Polish Jew, that the only person who ever had a really good look at the murderer unhesitatingly identified him but refused to swear against him. So we have definite ideas that Anderson, as I said before, in his memoirs, knew who the Ripper was, identified him as being a Polish Jew, but didn't name him or the witness. But what happens is really fascinating. In the 1980s, Donald Swanson, who was the guy immediately below him, who was directly in charge of the case, he has his own copy of Dr. Robert Anderson's memoirs, The Lighter Side of My Official Life. And in the margins of Swanson's own book, when it talks about the Jack the Ripper case, he makes the following notes. And this is for him, for his own mind, nobody else to read this, just for him. He puts, following that line about being a Polish Jew, that the only person ever to get a good look at the murderer unhesitatingly identified him but refused to swear against him. Swanson wrote in his own handwriting, because the suspect was also a Jew, and because his evidence would convict the suspect, the witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind. He then goes on to say, and after this identification, which the suspect knew, no other murder of its kind took place in London. After the suspect was identified at the seaside home, where he was sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified. The suspect was returned to his brother's house in Whitechapel by the police, City CID, who watched him day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Coney Hatch Asylum and died soon afterwards. And he wrote, after that, Kosminski was the suspect. So you have Donald Swanson identifying in his own copy of Anderson's memoirs exactly who the Ripper was. This Kosminski or Kosmansky or Kosminski, the variations of the spelling. So you actually have his own personal notes saying that he was Jack the Ripper, that Kosmansky figure was. So that's rather fascinating, isn't it? You've actually got this guy writing for his own memoir, for nobody else's reference other than his own. This is the guy. So what do you think of that?
That sounds very plausible, my friend. And I think that makes better sense because he would have known the area. He would have been, intimately familiar with the ins and outs. Well,
yeah.
quite literally of this particular time and place. So I think. And my mother was a huge fan of Jack the Ripper. The research that she put into it, and it was her conclusion as well before she died that he too was the original killer. Was the killer.
Excellent. Well, thankfully, a chap called Martin Fido decided to pick up this storyline and dig a bit deeper. Now, I've kind of followed his path with this and looked into what he's researched, and I can see why he says what he says, and I've come to the same conclusions. He decided the best thing to do was to try and find Kosminski. There's various spellings, as I say. Although the book, Anderson's book, gives Kosminski as the definitive version of the name, it isn't the definitive version in the original documents. As I say, the different spellings of Kosminski, Kaminsky, or Kosmansky are the spellings. Now, Martin Fido finds in medical records a Nathan Kaminsky, so one of the spellings, in the 23rd of March 1888, was checked in for possibly suffering with syphilis, possibly, not for definite, for 6 weeks. And was released soon afterwards, having supposedly been cured. Now, the name fits, the age kind of fits. We're looking at someone who was probably fairly young. But what's interesting is this guy, Nathan Kaminsky, lives in Black Lion Yard. Now, if you draw a line from Black Lion Yard to Mitre Square, you go straight through Galston Street, where the piece of cloth was found. So, if you think about it, if you've got someone running from Mitre Square, goes through the underpass at Galston Street, or the pathway there, drops the piece of cloth and ends up at Black Lion Yard. So it forms a straight line. You know, it's almost as if this is how the guy escaped, because he went this way. You know, the police that were in the area were on the other side of the square at the time, so they may well have seen someone leaving the square, but wouldn't necessarily have known who it was, or that it was Ripper, because the body was found fairly soon afterwards. So it could be that the police officer was identifying this person they saw leaving Mitre Square, and that he was in a straight line. It was Nathan Kaminsky.
That makes perfect sense, right? The quickest way between 2 points is a straight line.
Absolutely. But it goes further, gets even more interesting. Nathan Kaminsky was employed as a bootmaker. Now, bootmakers use leather aprons. Interesting. If you remember right back in the last year, at the beginning, they were already talking during the time of the murders. Now, this is the people in Whitechapel. They were saying there was a man, they were calling leather apron. He was going around threatening women.
That's right.
So this
I remember that from last time. So we were having more of a connection here, my friend.
Absolutely. Now, this leather apron individual disappears. He's not identified. If it's Nathan Kaminsky, then it could well be that he was away, sort of being looked after for a while because he'd fallen ill, but then recovered, supposedly, and was released. But it could be that this is the same person who's threatening women. Because the mystery is Nathan Kaminsky, having been identified as being living in the area and identified as being in the infirmary for a period of time, supposedly with syphilis. Now, often mental illness that was manifesting itself was believed to be caused by syphilis. You know, mental illness in those days, and this, I must admit, I missed this off here, this is important, they look for an external medical cause. You know, the idea of syphilis as number one because it was known to cause insanity. But if someone was displaying unusual, strange behaviour, it was thought to be caused by outside elements. Obviously, in times when they talk about demon possession, of course. This is not those times. This is a little bit more sensible, but they would still look for a bacterial, virological cause for mental illness. The idea of human psychology that we know now can be entirely internal. So they would treat him with what they thought was syphilis because he was acting odd. You with me?
I do. I see what that means, yes.
Now, the interesting thing is, Nathan Kaminsky vanishes. There's no record of his death at all, a person by that name at all. He simply seems to vanish. But there could be a good reason for this. Because in December the 7th, 1888, a man is arrested outside a brothel raving, acting insane, threatening women who are in the brothel. He is given the name David Cohen. and is taken away to the police, where he's then transferred from the police to Coney Hatch Asylum and dies in 1889. Now, interestingly enough, Mr. Fuddy did a lot of research on this. The name David Cohen is often given to people of a Jewish descent at that time who could not be identified, i.e. like John Doe or Jane Doe. You have in America, we call John Smith, was the name we would use. If they're Jewish and they can't be ascertained their identity, they're called David Cohen. So is it possible, since December the 7th, we're talking about less than a month after Mary Jane Kelly, this guy is found outside a brothel completely raving. Now, it is certainly possible that someone's mind could finally have snapped. If he's a serial killer, needs the outlet of that real violent murder, and because of the heavy police patrols, the vigilance committees, and all those kind of people keeping their eyes out, he simply can't find a victim, you know. The fact there were fewer prostitutes on the street. Often they would work together in twos for obvious reasons, but to protect each other. So finding a single lone victim he could get his hands on was probably proven to be quite difficult. It could be that it just got too much and he was literally outside, just lost the plot basically. He had a total psychotic breakdown. He was arrested outside this brothel and taken away. So he was quickly taken to the asylum in Coney Hatch and died in 1889. I think it was March 1889, but there was no indication of his identity. You know, you don't have a passport, you don't have a driving license or anything like that. You know, nothing to identify who you are. It's unusual to have been called David Cohen. It tended to be that name that was given to people whose identity they couldn't establish. He was listed in the Coney Hatch Asylum as being a tailor, but the fact of the matter is, again, if you can't identify these people, they tend to be listed as being bootmakers or tailors, one of those two professions. So it's entirely possible his mind basically just couldn't take it anymore, had totally lost the plot because he couldn't find a victim between the 8th of November and early December, and just lost it, completely lost it. So I think the information that we've managed to uncover on this character, this Nathan Kaminsky, aka David Cohen, to me suggests this is Jack the Ripper.
Wow. What a detective story, Mr. Mercer.
Thank you.
That was exhausting, my friend. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you did that for 4 hours.
I haven't finished yet, don't worry.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
There's an important caveat that has to be mentioned, because one of the other definitive spellings that was given was Kosminski. Now, there is an Aaron Kosminski, who is found in the Coney Hatch Asylum. Now, he went in 1891. So you have another poor Jewish Polish immigrant who has lost the plot, who's locked into an asylum in 1891. Now, the name Aaron Kosminski fits better, but there's lots of problems with this guy, because 1891 was 2.5, 3 years after Mary Jane Kelly, and yet there's been no further murders. The description of Kosminski is that he's essentially harmless, that he listens to his own voices in his head that tell him not to take a bath or take food from strangers. And he lives until 1919. There's no occasions or records of any kind of violence with his stay in Coney Hatch Asylum, apart from one occasion when he threw a chair at an attendant because they wanted him to have a bath, which he didn't want to do. So, although his name fits, his identity doesn't, because of the way in which he acts. So there is an interesting problem here, because you've got two names, Nathan Kaminsky, aka David Cohen, who, as I say, he's in the Coney Hatch Asylum records as David Cohen, but his description and there's factors about this person that fit the idea he's Nathan Kaminsky, because, as I say, Kaminsky had disappeared, so he probably had lost his reason and is being called David Cohen. And then you've got this other person, Kosminski, who appears to fit in terms of name and same kind of age, apparently, but the way his life is, if you like, it doesn't fit the idea of him being this violent serial killer. So you do have a bit of a problem. There's a bit of a potential mix-up going on between these two identities. But I think there's enough evidence to say that Nathan Kaminsky is almost certainly is the Ripper. The nod towards the fact that more often than not you tend to find the Aaron Kosminski as being named is because its name fits with that version of the memoranda, as I said, that lists those 3 spellings, because the later version of this same list of 3 names does give Kosminski as being the definitive spelling, although the earlier version, which is in note form, does include Kaminsky, as in Nathan Kaminsky's spelling. So that, for some reason, it was been reproduced with only the first of the 3 spellings listed, and people have jumped on that saying, well, that's Kaminsky, not Kosminski, it's a different spelling. But I think that's because the names have been, the alternate spellings were dropped for whatever reason, and the one definitive spelling was used, possibly because, as I say, that's the spelling Swanson gave us, Kosminski, so that could be the problem there. There you go. So that's kind of where it sits now. When you have other theories put forward and other people being identified, they have to deal with this list of 3 suspects. You can't get away from it. This is the definitive, by pretty much all the top brass. These are the 3 people they thought most likely. As I say, prima facie, you can understand the case against Druitt as being possible, because it kind of fits in, partly with that idea of being a prosperous, better, well-to-do person. That's because that idea was in the media, but it doesn't really fit the case. Kosminski almost uniquely fits this story. Incidentally, the 3rd person on the list, Michael Ostrog, is almost missing. He's unidentified. There's no one by that name is ever recorded until much later on. I think it's 1890 odd. And Michael Ostrog turns up. He's not a doctor. He's a confidence stricter. He's never killed anybody. He's been in and out of prison for most of his adult life. But he's a thief, basically. He cons people out of money. He's never committed any violent serial murder of any kind in his life. He's never killed anybody. So how this, and this is the only Michael Ostrog of Russian descent they could find, how his name got onto this list in the first place itself remains a bit of a mystery. But Nathan Kaminsky, I think, is by far the best suspect. I know I'm not the only one who does think this. I know there's many who don't, many who'd prefer it to be other people. But there's just there is not enough evidence to convict anybody at the end of the day, But I think there's enough evidence to say that Nathan Kaminsky, stroke David Cohen, is the Ripper, and the Aaron Kosminski got dragged in because of the similarity of names, and that's the main reason why he's in there. But, my lord, I rest my case.
And you did a phenomenal job at it. And I think that this radio program will be put down as the comprehensive study of Jack the Ripper. And really, nobody needs to read anything after this one. Just archive it, download it. That's all that you really need.
Okay. So there we have it. That was it. That was my marathon waffle about Jack the Ripper. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed the discussion as well. We do now have our own Facebook page. It is actually up and running, the Transatlantic Paranormal Radio Show. You can find us. If you click on me or Ron, you'll find a link to the page itself, and you'll happen to put posts or message us about anything you want us think we could possibly talk about in the future. But, we would like to hear from you, what you think of the show. If you agree with us, if you think we're talking rubbish, by all means, let us know. And hopefully we can move forward with some more interesting topics later on, Ron.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to feedback from the listeners and let them know. I'd like them to let us know what they're interested in hearing, and we'll see if we can do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're looking for new ideas, guys. A lot of radio shows talk about similar kind of topics. We want to try and move it to something different that isn't covered quite so often. So hopefully we can get some interesting stuff going. But anyway, that's enough from me. So it's good night from here in the UK, and over to you, Ron.
I think we can dismiss the jurors now. We can all go home with this case settled.
I think so. We've exhausted them. We probably want to go home and have a cup of tea.
Absolutely. All right, my friend. Hey, I'm going to let you go. Because the thing is, balancing this idea of being a world-class radio host, which I'm sure that you're having a difficulty doing as well. You also have to balance it to being a husband, and that doesn't work out quite well on days whenever my wife has a dinner date planned. So I'm going to go do that with her now, so I will have some place to sleep tonight, and then we will talk to each other very, very soon.
Indeed, that sounds like a good idea, and I should disappear off and soothe my voice with a nice cup of coffee. I'll speak to you soon.
All right, have a good one, my buddy.
You too, my friend, and goodbye to everyone who's listening. Hopefully you'll tune us in again soon. Bye-bye.
This is Barry Fitzgerald from Ghost Hunters International. In my book, In the Mist of Gods, I explore the world of the fairies or fae. This is not the whimsical winged creatures romanticized in modern literature and popular culture, but old-world, intelligent, and sometimes dangerous beings hidden in the tunnels, mounds, and rafts in countries all over the world. Known by many names, the fae coexist with mankind and at times come in direct contact with unsuspecting people whose lives are changed forever. In the Mist of Gods is a powerful book that chronicles my years of research into the enigma and legend of the fairy and examines their metamorphosis into the modern-day extraterrestrial phenomena. In the Mist of Gods is available in both softcover and Kindle format on Amazon and on glenandtea.com.
Have you ever wanted to visit the south of Italy? Amalfi, Ravello, Positano, Sorrento, places of immense beauty on the Amalfitana coast. Nearby Vesuvius stands proud against the sky, shadowing the ancient Roman ruins of Pompeii. In the midst of all this beauty lies the picturesque hillside village of Pontoni that dates back to the Middle Ages. Stay in Pontoni, in the self-catering apartments of Il Petrale, the beautiful casa belonging to Cara Miana Rispoli, who will warmly welcome you when you arrive. Il Petrale, a haven of peace in the heart of this magnificent place called Pontoni. For more information, email us at carminerispoli@email.it. That's Carmine Rispoli, CarmineRispoli, @email.it.